So we are finishing up Chapter 19, Section 4 in your U.S. History book. We're going to be going over the men in the White House. And we see the presidents here. We see the 18th president as Ulysses S. Grant. We see the 19th president as Rutherford B. Hayes. James Garfield being the 20th president. Chester Arthur, I call him Chet Arthur. That's what they called him back then. He would be the 21st president. Grover Cleveland was the 22nd and the 24th, as he had a non-consecutive term, 2 terms non-consecutively. And Benjamin Harrison as the 23rd, and William McKinley here as the 25th. So we're going to go over these presidents. Probably do half of them in this video and divide them into 2 videos, because going in and telling a little bit about their lives and what they did during this time, during the Gilded Ages. These are presidents of the Gilded Age. Grant came, of course, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and his Vice President Johnson became president, and then Grant was elected as the 20th president. So we have these times during the Reconstruction of the South on to up to 1900. So we have covering a vast amount, if we think from 1870s to 1900. So Ulysses S. Grant. I think I told you before, his name really wasn't Ulysses S. Grant. His name was Hiram. But because at West Point they put his name as Ulysses S., he said the S doesn't sit down for anything, but he kind of liked it because it looked like it said U.S. Grant as his name. So he went by Ulysses S. Grant. And from 1869 to 1877, he would be the 18th president. And he's the general who saved the Union. He was with the Republican Party, same as Abraham Lincoln, same as Fremont, so Republican Party, 1868. And his policy was to help reunite the nation and to heal the wounds of the Civil War between the North and the South. His saying is, let us have peace. And so he wanted peace in the United States. He was an upright and honest president, but unscrupulous men took advantage of his lack of political experience, and we'll find that during his reign, there was a lot of schemes, financial schemes, and a lot of dishonest men in the midst of what was going on. So we'll find out a lot of corruption in that. He had confidence in human nature, which we can't have confidence in human nature, can we? I love that picture of Grant when he was a general. Pretty good-looking young man. Grant was the youngest president up to this point, so. Schemes. Let's talk about those schemes. We have the Black Friday Panic. Well, there's 2 guys here, Jay Gould and James Fisk. Gould, think of gold, because it's going to be a gold scam. Gould and Fisk. Gould lived 1836 to 1892, and James from 1834 to 1872. Didn't really live very long lives. Anyway, they were pretty much connivers. And what they did is to buy up gold in the country so they could make the cost of gold go up. They'd buy it up, buy a bunch of gold and everything, and then try to get gold not to be issued by the government. In that way, they could make the gold cost go up and, sell the gold at high and, basically have it fall. And so they were trying to manipulate things. And so they wanted the United States to stop issuing of gold temporarily. And this would crash the stock market. And it did on Friday, September 21st, 1869. This is called Black Friday. And here we have the scandal here. Jay Gould and Fisk here. And these 2 pictures looking like replicable guys, but they weren't. It said Fisk and Gould's friend. They were friends with Abel Corbin, and Abel Corbin was President Grant's brother-in-law, so we're talking about his precious, Julia or whatever, her brother-in-law. And so they went and took Corbin and Corbin to convince President Grant not to sell government gold at this time. and this would lower the worth of the gold that they purchased. Well, when Grant finally found out what was being done at this point, this plot, he ordered the sale then of $1 million of government gold. Anyway, Grant did not get indicted on or implicated on the midst of this whole thing, and he was totally against it, and finally found out what was going on. But it was clear not only people involved, but even his brother-in-law involved in this scheme of manipulating, the government to the point of causing financial panics leading to a possible depression. Here's a panic, because everybody when you say panic, everybody runs to the bank and gets their money out, right? That's a panic. They think, oh, the banks are going to close. The Credit Mobilier scandal also happened during this time. This is a big one too, because what they did is the Union Pacific Railroad, which was one of the top monopoly railroads, very wealthy, they created a fake railroad company. And so they would have people invest in it, but they would also, as they invested in it and becoming part of the Union Railroad, Union Pacific Railroad, they would bring in the construction cost and charge, the government. And instead of building, they have a fake railroad. Instead, they just basically pocketed $44 million. That's a lot of money. And they sold shares to congressmen in the public office and bribed them. And not bribing them by not telling anyone, they bribed these congressmen. And they made huge profits from this scheme. The vice president under Grant at this time was named Schuyler Colfax. Schuyler Colfax actually was implicated in this. And President Grant was absolved from wrongdoing for this too. He wasn't involved in it, but there was a lot of people, politicians underneath him that were involved. In fact, later on, we find out even in politics with the presidents after Grant, some of them had possibly been implemented. One of them was a politician from Maine, Blaine from Maine, and he was very good friends with both President Garfield and later on with President Benjamin Harrison. So Garfield, like I said, I don't know anything about it, but he was kind of protecting his friend Blaine. Later on, we find that possibly Blaine was involved in this credit, and that's what prevented him from becoming president. He never did become president, but so this was very important. Basically, and you know what? It's done now. If you look in California, they're like collecting money for this bullet train that's supposed to be like better than BART or better than the subways. And they've been collecting it on for years and years and years, and they haven't done a single thing, basically taking all this money. So there's a lot of different, this kind of type of scheme goes on quite a bit. And so it's very important that in politics, as people get involved with political ambitions, because maybe they know something's going to happen. They say because politically they find out, so they go and invest in something. They know that invest in gold because gold's going to be manipulated, or they're going to invest in this because this is what politically we're going to do, because they have a jump on things. And a lot of people make a lot of money illegally, I would say, and getting kickbacks and this kind of stuff. And that happened back then, but now it's even more common. And people just think it's no big deal these days. Back then, it was considered a scandal. But today, who knows? We have a lot of scandals that probably think, oh, well, that's not a big deal. But it is in the midst of things. Well, here's a picture of the Credit Mobilier scandal with basically saying they're constructing a new railroad, which they didn't do. Here's the king of frauds, how the Credit Mobilier brought its way through Congress. The bad thing is that a lot of politicians were involved in this. So colossal bribery. Congressmen who have robbed the people and who now support the national robber. How some men get fortunes. So anyway, here we go. Some big scandal happened under Grant, although Grant didn't get implicated in it, which he was pretty close. considering even his family wasn't involved in this one, but so a lot of people think, they look on Grant as, that he was a swindler, but we found out that he wasn't. He really didn't know. Grant was not a great politician. He didn't have a background in politics so much as some of the other presidents, but he had a heart towards American people. Grant won the second term. Of course, everyone considers Grant this big hero. Horace Greeley ran for Democrat Party and the liberal Republicans against him. Horace Greeley was an editor of the New York Tribune newspaper, and so he ran against Grant. Of course, Grant was considered the hero of the Civil War, so Grant ended up getting the presidency. In 1873, Grant vetoed an inflation bill that, if it would pass, would have dire consequences. So they put forth this inflation bill that would cause a lot of inflation and problems, but Grant caught it, and basically the inflation and depression didn't happen because of Grant. He desired to go back to the gold standard. At that time, they had a lot of greenbacks and stuff from the Civil War, and so he desired to go back to, which was a good idea at that time. And later on, Grant's memoirs were published by Mark Twain. You see, Grant was never a good businessman. In fact, before he was a general in the Civil War, he had tried quite a few business endeavors at that point, and ended up, not doing anything. I mean, actually, just chopping wood or something back then. And then he became this great hero of the Civil War, as having Lee surrendered to Grant, that great hero. Even while he was a president, he lost most of his money. And later on, he lost all of his money after he was out of the presidency. He lost all of his money in a business endeavor, had zilch. He was his family were bankrupt until he wrote his memoirs. And these are a picture of his books of memoirs there. And he wrote his memoirs, and Mark Twain published him. And then about 2 days, I think it was, after he wrote his memoirs, he died. He had throat cancer. He had a problem with alcohol sometimes, but he also he smoked a lot of cigars. So he had throat cancer. So he died of throat cancer in 1885. But after he died, everyone wanted his memoirs, and his family became wealthy on his memoirs. So despite him having a problem with business and everything that happened in his term, he basically said, I'm glad to be out of the presidency, because it was a pretty much turmoil for him. But through his life, his memoirs made more income and money for his family, and they became wealthy because of his memoirs after he died. So he was a war hero. Here's a picture of him. Let us have peace, Reconstruction. Anyway, Grant, of course, had a great victory, 1868 and 1872, as becoming president. The next president after Grant was Rutherford B. Hayes. I hope that you can see this on here good. Move it there. Rutherford B. Hayes was president 1877 to 1881. He was the 19th president. And he was a very honest president, too. He was a general in the Civil War. Almost all of the first presidents were generals in the Civil War of the Union in the North. And but always remember, Rutherford B. Hayes, his election, the election of 1876, was the most disputed election in history up until President Trump. Was the most disputed election. In fact, Democrat Samuel Tilden of New York was running against him, and it looked like Tilden had won the presidency. But then there were some questionable actions in the Electoral College and the electoral votes, you call them. I'm not saying Electoral College votes, electoral votes. And both parties had made mistakes, and so they had to recount certain states, so Florida, South Carolina, about 3 or 4 states. And in doing this, Hayes already resolved and said that he had lost the election, and he woke up winning the election, and they were saying that this is the way it went, that it was crazy, and that this shouldn't have happened, and we need to have the way they had to recount, and then they had to try to figure by one vote. It was crazy. And so they decided to go, the Democrats got together with the Republicans, and they decided to resolve it in a compromise of 1877, which basically said that right here, the compromise is here, that he would have to name a Southerner to his cabinet, and he would have to spend time rebuilding the South, and he would have to remove the military troops from the South. The removal of these troops was the end of the Reconstruction era. So he had to remove the Union military troops out of the South, which he did. So the compromise kind of made up for the election, the disputed election. So here's a picture of Tilden. He was of New York, and he actually was a good man, and he actually got rid of a lot of the Tweed bosses and stuff of New York. So both of these guys are known for their integrity. But Hayes became president. The Hayes administration, at this time, what happened? Well, there were high political principles he had through every problem. He basically tactfully and had a lot of wisdom in the midst. He's known for that in his administration. He withdrew the troops, just like he said he would do, and he started to reconstruct the South and to support the South in the midst to be able to get them to reconstruct after the South had been totally gone through and burned down and everything else due to the Civil War. So he also had attempts to reform the civil service, those that are going into service on the basis of qualifications, instead of just people just picking who they're going to be in their cabinet or just picking workers to work for them. They had to have certain requirements because in the midst of civil service, it would become very corrupt if they just picked whoever they wanted. So Hayes gained support to make reforms. In the midst of all this, he was a good president. His wife, Lucy, they would call her Lemonade Lucy because she refused to serve alcohol in the White House. And she also was really involved in political affairs. She was a very successful, intelligent, hospitable lady. She was educated. She was college educated, and she stood by her husband throughout his administration. Lemonade Lucy, that's a good way to know, with Hayes. On to James A. Garfield. He served as president in 1881, one part of a year, almost a year. So he was the 20th president. He lived from 1831 to 1881. He died this year. He died as a president. He was assassinated. So let's talk about Garfield. I really before Garfield was president, he did have he was involved in the Senate and everything in Congress. So he was the first Congress member that actually became president. He was involved in the Ohio Senate and such, and he had a political background, but when he was elected, he was considered a dark horse. Meant that he was just seemed like came out of nowhere, and then he was president. So what happened? Well, during the election of 1880, there were two groups of political Republicans. One group was called the Stalwarts, and the other group they just called the Moderates or the Half-Breeds. Well, the Stalwarts, they opposed all civil service reform, and basically in the Stalwarts, there was a lot of corruption going on, actually. They wanted Stalwarts, they wanted to stall everything. That's why I call it stall. They wanted everything to be just like it was or is. And Garfield was very much for reforming, and not only reforming, he was very progressive in some things, especially he'd always been an abolitionist against slavery, so he really wanted to reform and bring forth so the Black Americans would be considered, especially, they were able to vote, and so his social reform is to help them. So he definitely was involved in that. He was a Christian. He was our only president that had been a preacher, actually. He had been a pastor. So after the 36th ballot of the Republican Party, so what happened with this 36th ballot? How did he get named? Well, the running mates were, to run for Republicans were Grant. Now, Grant already served 2 terms, and he wasn't so wild about going on to another, but of course everyone wanted him to. So Grant set forth. Of course, there were a lot of, during Grant's, there were a lot of schemes and corruption during that time. So he was like really willing to get done. And I think he was probably sick at that time because he had had cancer of the throat. But his another running for the presidency was Blaine. And Blaine from Maine was good friends with Garfield. And Blaine was also partially implemented in one of the scandals, although he said he did not do this, but because he was implicated, it also would implicate Garfield. But Garfield said he didn't know anything about it, and he wasn't. So anyway, through this whole thing, Blaine and Grant, and there was one other guy, I think, and they all were, over and over, they didn't get enough votes for their nomination. So they ended up that at the 36th ballot, they had to change things. And someone says, well, let's just put in a new name. How about James Garfield? Everybody liked him. He was very likable, and he had actually been involved in Congress, and everybody thought he was, of his integrity in Congress. They decided to put him in, and he's like, he really didn't want to. He goes, well, he really didn't want to. He says, well, go ahead. They put his name in. He didn't think he would in any way be nominated for president, and he was, because basically Grant and Blaine. There's one other guy, I can't think of his name right now, but those that were nominated, they all threw in and supported Garfield. So, his vice president was named was Chester Arthur, and he was a stalwart. So now the stalwart's like, okay, Garfield is, he's moderate and stalwart. We have a stalwart as vice president. This should be good, because we're covering both sub-parties of the Republican Party. And so he then ran against General Winfield Scott Hancock of Pennsylvania. And the Greenback Party was divided among the Democrats. And so Garfield became the 20th president. Everyone thought Winfield Scott Hancock was very famous of Pennsylvania, that sure the Democrats would, but it did not happen. And so Garfield was the dark horse coming in and becoming president. But he became very popular. He was a born-again Christian. He had a pastor's background. He loved his family. He was young and vibrant. I mean, he took his boys and he could do, they were doing handstands, in the yard, at the White House or whatever. So he was a very vibrant, young. He was the youngest president, younger than Grant. So he was the youngest president up to that time. And so everyone looked to the future. He was very much progressive in getting rid of any corruption and reforming the civil service and all these things. So everyone looked to the future for him. Here's a picture of him. Here's a picture of his family here. He did have, I think there was 5 kids, but he had 7 kids. But his little girl, one baby died when she was born, and then he lost his little girl when he was 3 years old, when she was 3 years old, and that really affected him later on. But anyway, The Garfield administration. he expanded some of the federal authority, especially over the control of the New York Custom House. The New York Custom House is where they bring in, the ships would come in and they'd pay money to the United States government and tariffs. It's where we actually made most of the money for the federal government was in collecting these tariffs. Well, Senator Roscoe Conklin of New York was very powerful in controlling this custom house. So the first thing Garfield did is that he got rid of the collector there, his collector, knowing that there was corruption at the port where they took in the money, and he appointed a new port collector there. And so Senator Roscoe Conklin got very upset, and he actually resigned in the midst of all this. But Conklin was a stalwart, and so now there was another major division between Conklin and Garfield and in the Republican Party. And so, but the government became stronger in the midst of all this, and everyone looked to Garfield for what he was doing, as a brave thing. Here's a picture of Roscoe Conklin down here. This is a picture of Garfield towards the end of his life there, but there we have, during this time, I should say, he was very much, let me tell a little bit about Garfield, is that he was he came out of nowhere. He was actually came from the poorest because his dad died when he was like 2 years old, and his dad was a wrestler and also on the ships that came in, and that's what he wanted to do. But he ended up working for where you tow, on the Erie Canal, on the canal where they tow the different boats, which is a very low job. He got malaria. He went home, and his mother, raised up enough money so that he could go to school, and he ended up loving school. He read every book he could get his hand on. When he was 18, he went to a Christian school. Actually, went to a Christian school at 18. He got saved, gave his life to the Lord, and he became a preacher. He became a teacher, and everything he did was prospering at that time with Garfield. So, and here he's become president of the United States. But his presidency was cut short on September 1881. So Garfield was assassinated 4 months into his presidency. He was shot while waiting for a train. He was waiting for a train. He was going to go. He was actually with Senator Blaine, or his Secretary of State Blaine, and actually it was Lincoln's son was with him. There were a few people with him as he waited for this train. Out of the women's bathroom area comes Charles Guiteau. He says he's disgruntled, that he's a stalwart, and that he didn't get an office to go to consul to Paris. He was just crazy. And he was saying that, that he was treated, and he basically was doing this for God, and he shot James Garfield twice. He pleaded insanity. His dad said, basically later on, his father and his sister said he was very demonic, His sister said that he tried to kill her one time, So there's something very wrong with him. He also was involved with a commune cult, like a free love commune cult too. So he was quite a background. Although nowadays they think that it possibly was a conspiracy, because the stalwarts, including, the stalwarts of New York and such, some of them that were being indicted by President Garfield were, he actually said that he was representing them. So they still say possibly he was. So going on, we have James Garfield, for those months, between July and September, he lay in bed. And actually, his bullet was lodged in next to his ribs, but they thought, basically thought that the doctors, they kept going in and trying to find the bullet with their fingers and stuff, and they didn't use any sanitary technique at all, aseptic technique. And so their dirty fingers with germs and everything just made him get blood poisoning, and he actually died in mid-September of blood poisoning because the doctors had over and over put their hands, causing the infection to spread into septicemia, and he had they say in the midst of all this, his heart just had a heart attack. He lost weight. He was like 210 pounds, like 6 foot or something. And then he only weighed 135 pounds because he had lost so much weight. He was so sickly, and he died. After he died, there was the greatest procession you could imagine. They had a great funeral procession. Everyone during that time had been thinking about him, praying for him. He was a president. Can't believe that he was assassinated. Before this time, they didn't have protection. They didn't have bodyguards and such. And he didn't think that was a big deal. He thought, I don't need a bodyguard. Well, needless to say, he did. So he died in mid-September. And at that point, of course, his vice president, Chet Arthur, would become president. And he was a stalwart. The opposite, not the opposite party, but the section of parties that they thought that was they were being persecuted. So we ended up here now. All of that James Garfield set forth to do would be put on hold. So what would have happened? He was he was very vibrant, very popular, would have been a great president, but now his time was shut down. So we have here, he was 6 foot, he was raised in a poor farm, he was a Civil War hero. James Garfield was the poorest man ever to have become president. He was the first left-handed president. That's a trivia question. He was the first left-handed president. So the life of James Garfield, definitely he's in heaven. James Garfield did a defense of the Bible. He was a teacher in lay ministry. In Chagrin Falls, he actually defended the Bible against an atheist professor. The professor was sure as Garfield's defense would not be scientific, that Garfield was ready with the knowledge of the science in the Bible, and he astounded his hearers, took up the arguments one by one, using the professor's own authorities against him. They even said it was like an earthquake overturned everything. The professor had clearly lost the battle. The atheist professor lost the battle, and he was surprised and defeated. I think he probably came to the Lord later on. This was the first time he had met a man so gifted and so learned to be his adversary. Garfield's strong defense of the truth of the scriptures turned the tide of unbelief in the entire town. Here's a young picture of Garfield, and here's his defense of the Bible. Garfield had his sermons. I love this last one. End here on President Garfield, but he said, men are tending to materialism. Houses, lands, and worldly goods attract their attention, and as a mirage lure them on to death. Christianity, on the other hand, leads only the natural body to death, and for the spirit it points out a house not built with hands, the eternal in the heavens. He says, let me urge you to follow him, not as a Nazarene, the man of Galilee, the carpenter's son, but as the ever-living spiritual person, full of love and compassion, who will stand by you in life and death and in eternity. Then he writes, James Garfield. So this is what he wrote in his sermon. Here's a picture of his little 3-year-old that he loved so much. And he said, I will see her in heaven. And indeed, he is in heaven with his beautiful little daughter and family. James Garfield.